It wasn't gold that made empires. It was silver. Rivers of it, pouring from the mountains of Mexico and Peru, fueling Europe's rise, dooming millions, and reshaping the global economy. This is the story of the metal that built the modern world, and the devastation it left behind. In 1545, high in the barren, wind-scoured mountains of modern-day Bolivia, a young indigenous man named Diego Hualpa reportedly stumbled upon something glinting beneath the soil as he searched for lost llamas. What he had found was not just silver. It was the richest silver deposit the world had ever seen. The place would be called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill, and it would become the beating heart of Spain's colonial empire in the Americas. Almost overnight, the desolate mining camp of Potosí exploded into one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. By the late 1500s, it rivaled London, Paris, and Seville in population. At its peak, it was home to over 150,000 people, a mix of Spanish settlers, indigenous laborers, enslaved Africans, merchants, and adventurers, all drawn to the promise of silver. The wealth pouring out of Cerro Rico was so immense that a common saying of the era declared a bridge could be built from Potosí to Spain using only silver bars. But Potosí was not the only vein in the empire's newly discovered wealth. In northern New Spain, modern-day Mexico, miners uncovered another bonanza in Zacatecas, which was founded in 1546. Located in the rugged highlands north of Mexico City, Zacatecas would quickly become Mexico's largest silver producer, and together with other sites like Guanajuato and San Luis Potosí, formed the backbone of Spain's colonial economy. The timing of these discoveries was no accident. Following the initial conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, Spanish ambitions turned from mere exploration to exploitation. The crown, driven by rising costs of European warfare and imperial competition, needed a steady stream of revenue to maintain its dominance. And silver, far more abundant and easier to process than gold, was the answer. Spanish officials implemented a system that combined royal control with private initiative. Private entrepreneurs primarily worked the mines under royal licenses, while the Spanish crown imposed a quinto real, a 20% tax on all precious metals extracted. This lucrative arrangement meant that as long as silver flowed, Spain's empire could expand. What made Potosí and Zacatecas truly transformative, however, was not just the sheer volume of silver, but how quickly they became connected to global markets. Caravans of llamas, mules, and enslaved laborers hauled silver to the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. From there, fleets transported it to Spain or across the Pacific to Manila, where it was traded for Asian goods. The discovery of silver at Potosí and Zacatecas marked a turning point in world history. These were not just mines, they were engines of empire. They reshaped global trade routes, upended local economies, and bound together continents in ways never seen before. But beneath the shimmer of wealth lay the dark shadow of what would follow: forced labor, mass death, and environmental ruin, all in the name of extracting silver from the bones of mountains. The discovery of silver at Potosí and Zacatecas set off a fevered race, not just for wealth, but for the ability to extract it at scale. The silver wasn't lying in neat piles waiting to be picked up. It was locked deep within the mountains. And to get to it, the Spanish colonizers needed tools, systems, and, most of all, people. At first, rudimentary mining methods prevailed. Narrow shafts were carved into the rock using iron picks and wooden supports. Miners descended by rope ladders, hauling ore in rawhide sacks strapped to their backs. But as demand for silver grew, so did the need for more efficient extraction. By the late 1500s, Spanish engineers had adapted and imported advanced European mining technologies, including windlasses, water pumps, and stamp mills to crush ore. The biggest revolution came in 1557 with the introduction of the patio process, developed by Bartolomé de Medina in Mexico. This ingenious technique used mercury to extract silver from low-grade ores. Crushed rock was spread in large open-air patios, mixed with salt, copper sulfate, and mercury, and then trampled, often by enslaved workers or animals, until the silver amalgamated. The mixture was then washed and heated to separate the pure metal. The patio process allowed silver extraction to expand exponentially, but it came at a horrific cost. Mercury, absorbed through the skin or inhaled during processing, led to widespread poisoning, neurological damage, and death. Entire populations, especially indigenous laborers, suffered silently under this toxic innovation. Labor was the beating engine of the mines, and in the Andean regions, the Spanish revived and reshaped an ancient Inca system known as the Mita. Under Inca rule, the Mita was a form of tribute labor for public works. Under Spanish control, it became a brutal system of forced service. Each year, thousands of indigenous men were drafted from highland villages and marched to Potosí to serve 6 to 8 month shifts underground. Conditions were appalling. Miners worked 12 to 16-hour days in dark, suffocating shafts, often with little food, rest, or medical care. Cave-ins, toxic air, and mercury exposure killed many. Some never returned home. In Mexico, the crown didn't formally impose the Mita, but the outcome was similar. Spanish landowners and mine operators used a combination of wage labor, debt peonage, and outright coercion to maintain a steady workforce. Enslaved Africans were also used, particularly in refining and hauling tasks, as they were believed, falsely, to be more resistant to disease and physical strain. Despite the suffering, the mines operated with astonishing efficiency. Potosí alone produced over half of the world's silver supply in the second half of the 16th century. The scale was staggering and unprecedented. The success of the mining system revealed a chilling truth. The empire didn't require consent. It needed only a mountain full of metal, a method to extract it, and a population to exploit. The Spanish had all three, and in perfecting this machinery of extraction, they laid the blueprint for colonial economies across the Americas. Economies built not on collaboration, but on compulsion. The silver that poured from the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas enriched empires, adorned the courts of Europe, and reshaped the global economy. But behind every bar of gleaming metal was a human story, one of agony, endurance, and unimaginable loss. For the indigenous peoples of the Andes and central Mexico, the silver rush was not a tale of opportunity. It was a sentence. At Potosí, the Cerro Rico, the rich hill, was both a promise and a curse. Towering above the city at over 15,000 feet, its slopes were riddled with tunnels and shafts, some plunging hundreds of feet into the earth. The Spanish called it a mountain of silver. The indigenous miners had another name, the mouth of hell. Those conscripted into the Mita system came from hundreds of miles away. Young men from villages across the highlands were taken from their families to fulfill their quota of labor service, 6 to 8 months in the mines, sometimes longer. The journey to Potosí itself was grueling. Many walked for weeks through snow-choked passes and arid valleys to reach the city. Some never made it. Once there, the reality of mining life was worse than anything they could have imagined. Miners descended into narrow shafts with little more than a candle, a pickaxe, and their own fear. Oxygen was scarce. Temperatures swung from cold to blistering heat. Explosions were frequent. So were cave-ins. If a miner was crushed or trapped, his body was often left where it fell. Recovering it could mean risking more lives and slowing production. The Spanish colonial elite rarely set foot in these tunnels. Instead, they delegated oversight to capatazes, or overseers, many of whom were ruthless and violent. Indigenous miners were forced to work 12 to 16-hour shifts, sometimes longer, with only brief rests and minimal food. Accidents were common. Safety equipment was non-existent. Dust filled their lungs, and the constant exposure to mercury, arsenic, and other toxins left many with chronic illnesses. Then came the mercury. With the introduction of the patio process, mercury became a central element in refining silver ore. In both Potosí and Mexican mines, like Zacatecas and Guanajuato, workers were required to stomp and mix mercury-laced ore with their bare feet, or shovel it by hand. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin. Symptoms of poisoning included tremors, memory loss, hallucinations, and ultimately, death. Spanish officials understood the dangers, but the profitability outweighed any moral hesitation. Children were not spared. Though not formally conscripted into the Mita, many indigenous children were forced to work in support roles, hauling materials, sorting ore, or tending to animals used in the milling process. Their small bodies were useful for crawling into collapsed tunnels or hauling rocks where grown men could not fit. Some children as young as 8 worked full days. The death toll among them remains unknown. The psychological toll was just as brutal. Far from home and under constant stress, many miners suffered deep emotional trauma. Suicide was not uncommon. Others attempted escape, only to be hunted down by Spanish militias or rival indigenous groups who promised rewards for their return. The mine was not just a workplace, it was a prison. Yet amid the suffering, acts of quiet resistance were endured. Some indigenous miners engaged in subtle sabotage, damaging equipment, hiding silver, or intentionally botching loads of ore. Others formed underground networks of solidarity, sharing what little food and knowledge they had to keep one another alive. Some elders passed down traditional herbal remedies to ease pain and treat mercury sickness. Others led secret rituals deep in the mines, calling upon the spirits of the earth for protection. The Catholic Church, ever present in Spanish colonies, offered little solace. At the same time, some priests condemned the abuses. Most viewed the silver boom as a divine blessing. Masses were held in chapels funded by silver wealth. Saints were paraded through the streets of Potosí, even as miners died beneath them. By the end of the 16th century, Potosí had become one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London or Paris, with a population of over 100,000. But the wealth that built its churches, theaters, and palaces came at a staggering human cost. Historians estimate that over 8 million people may have died in or because of the mines at Potosí between the 1500s and 1800s. While the exact number is debated, what is not contested is the scale of suffering. In Mexico, similar horrors played out. Although the Mita system wasn't officially used, indigenous peoples were bound through debt peonage and coercive labor systems that mirrored the same brutality. Enslaved Africans were also worked to death in refineries and transport chains. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse were rampant. The story of the mines is not just about economics or empire. It is about lives broken to fuel a global system. It is about how silver became more than a precious metal. It became a mirror, reflecting the worst of colonial ambition and the resilience of those crushed beneath it. As silver flowed into the coffers of Spain, the blood of countless indigenous and African laborers soaked the ground it came from. And yet, they endured. Their descendants live on, and the mountain still stands. By the mid-1500s, Spain was no longer simply an empire of conquest. It was an empire of extraction, and silver was its lifeblood. From the mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in New Spain, Mexico, staggering quantities of silver flowed steadily across oceans, transforming Spain into a global superpower and reshaping the very foundations of the world economy. But this silver wasn't hoarded. It moved. And as it moved, it changed everything it touched. Each year, fleets of galleons left the Americas loaded with silver bars, coinage, and ingots. From Veracruz on the Gulf Coast of Mexico or the port of Callao in Peru, silver was carried to the hub of Spanish imperial trade, Seville. Once in Spain, it paid for wars, funded monarchs, propped up economies, and lined the pockets of merchants from Antwerp to Genoa. But the true reach of American silver extended far beyond Europe. Spain's Asian ambitions gave birth to one of the most remarkable economic circuits in early modern history, the Manila Galleons. From 1565 onward, Spanish ships sailed from Acapulco across the vast Pacific to Manila in the Philippines. There, American silver met the merchants of Ming and Qing China, who had one consistent demand: silver. Why? By the late 16th century, the Chinese economy had begun shifting from a barter-based or paper money system to a silver standard. Taxes were increasingly collected in silver, and the metal became crucial to everyday transactions. But China had limited silver reserves, and thus, its hunger for Spanish-American silver was insatiable. It is estimated that more than 1/3 of all silver mined in the Americas ultimately ended up in China. This trans-Pacific trade was the first truly global economic loop. Silver from Bolivia and Mexico went to Spain, then crossed to Manila, then entered Chinese markets. In return, silks, spices, porcelain, and tea flowed back across the Pacific, luxuries that enriched Spain's colonies and Europe's elite. At every step, silver shaped systems. It bankrolled European militaries, allowed Spain to fight wars on multiple fronts, and inflated monarchs' ambitions. In the Ottoman Empire, it disrupted traditional trade routes. In West Africa, it became a tool of negotiation and sometimes of enslavement. In Japan, it pushed the Tokugawa shogunate to rethink its role in foreign trade. In China, it caused dramatic price shifts, led to tax revolts, and eventually created economic dependencies with long-term consequences. Yet, the irony was sharp. Spain, despite controlling the flow of silver, was often bankrupt. Monarchs like Philip II borrowed heavily, and much of the silver that reached Europe passed quickly into the hands of creditors and foreign banks. The wealth of an empire leaked away faster than it arrived. Meanwhile, in the colonies, the people who mined the silver remained in crushing poverty. The towns that grew rich, like Potosí, were anomalies. Most indigenous communities saw none of the wealth their labor extracted. Enslaved Africans working the silver refineries in Mexico and Peru lived and died in anonymity. The benefits of the silver boom remained at the top of imperial hierarchies. Even so, silver connected the world in a way nothing else had before. Some scholars call this period the beginning of true globalization, not because of ideas or people, but because of silver. A single coin minted in Potosí, stamped with the Spanish crown, could be found in the pockets of a merchant in Beijing, a sultan in Istanbul, or a trader in Amsterdam. It was a global currency before the world had an international consensus. The pieces of 8, as the Spanish silver coins became known, became the backbone of international trade. Recognized for their purity and weight, they were trusted across cultures, borders, and even rival empires. Pirate crews, smugglers, and legitimate merchants all favored them. In time, they even influenced the design of the US dollar. But this economic revolution had its limits and its costs. The flood of silver into global markets caused inflation across Europe, especially in Spain. Prices of basic goods rose dramatically, causing the poor to suffer while the wealthy invested. In China, dependency on silver made the empire vulnerable to supply shocks, especially during times of war or disruption in the Americas. And the relentless demand for silver kept the pressure on the mines, driving more forced labor, more environmental destruction, and more human suffering. The silver rush wasn't just about money. It was about systems. It was about how empires were built, how colonialism was financed, how global inequality was born, and how the sweat of millions, indigenous, African, and impoverished, fueled the rise of what would become the modern world. When we speak of the 16th century global economy, we are speaking of silver. And when we speak of silver, we must remember where it came from, who dug it from the earth, and what it ultimately cost. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Empire was the largest and most powerful political entity on earth. Its banners flew from the high plateaus of the Andes to the coastal ports of the Philippines. But behind the grandeur, beneath the gilded thrones and golden cathedrals, lay a brutal, single truth. The empire was addicted to silver. Spain's entire colonial engine ran on the relentless extraction of precious metals, especially silver from Mexico and Peru. While other empires diversified trade, developed manufacturing, or taxed their populations directly, Spain took a shortcut. It leaned almost entirely on wealth pulled from the ground. Silver wasn't just profit, it was lifeblood. The consequences of this dependence were immense and increasingly dangerous. Silver allowed Spain to wage wars it could not otherwise afford. From the Dutch revolt in the Low Countries to the defense of Catholicism in France and the empire's perpetual conflict with the Ottoman Turks, silver funded armies, built fleets, and bought allies. Even the disastrous Spanish Armada launched against England in 1588 was paid for in large part with American silver. That invasion failed. The debts, however, remained. In fact, Spain declared state bankruptcy 4 times between 1557 and 1596. Despite controlling the richest mines in the known world, the empire often couldn't pay its bills. How was this possible? The problem lay in overextension. Silver wealth created an illusion of unlimited resources. Monarchs, driven by divine mission and imperial pride, overcommitted to global projects. They borrowed heavily, spent lavishly, and failed to invest in sustainable development at home. Rather than building a strong domestic economy, Spain imported manufactured goods from abroad. Clothing from Flanders, weapons from Italy, luxury goods from France, and from the German states. Spanish merchants grew lazy. Local industries stagnated. Why build when you could buy? And so, as silver flowed into Seville, it poured right back out again, into the hands of foreign creditors and traders. The empire became a transit zone for wealth, not a producer of it. Meanwhile, the cost of silver extraction soared. Mining operations required increasingly vast inputs of labor, mercury, food, tools, and capital. The crown imposed the quinto real, a 20% tax on all silver mined. But by the late 1500s, even that wasn't enough. The monarchy began granting asientos, contracts to private financiers who managed the flow of silver, handled logistics, and even ran portions of the empire's bureaucracy in exchange for future profit. In essence, Spain mortgaged its own empire. At the heart of this machine was the city of Potosí, perched 13,000 feet above sea level on the side of a mountain the Spanish called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill. By 1600, Potosí had become one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling London and Paris in population. It was a furnace of labor, wealth, and death. Thousands of indigenous and enslaved African workers were forced into the mines under the brutal Mita system, where many would perish from cave-ins, mercury poisoning, and exhaustion. Yet the silver kept coming. And with every shipment, the empire's heartbeat quickened and grew more erratic. The over-reliance on silver created what modern economists call a resource curse. Short-term wealth masked long-term weakness. When the flow of silver slowed, due to uprisings, mine collapses, or global price shifts, the empire trembled. By the 1590s, inflation had taken hold across Spain. Known as the price revolution, this economic phenomenon saw the cost of goods skyrocket. For ordinary people, bread became unaffordable, wages stagnated, economic inequality worsened. The wealth of the empire failed to trickle down. Meanwhile, rival powers watched and learned. England, the Dutch Republic, and France saw the pitfalls of Spain's model. They built more balanced economies and invested in naval power. Eventually, they began carving out their own colonies, with an eye not just on silver, but on commodities, trade routes, and settler economies. Spain's head start was slipping. And yet, Spanish monarchs clung to their dream, that silver alone could sustain the empire. They sent more viceroys, more galleons, more tax collectors. They demanded more from indigenous peoples, from enslaved Africans, from colonial administrators. The machine kept grinding. The gears turned faster, but the engine was wearing down. It's a paradox historians still grapple with. How could the wealthiest empire in the world be so poor? The answer lies in dependence. Spain mistook extraction for progress. It confused imperial reach with imperial strength. And it failed to recognize that true power lies not in what you pull from the earth, but in what you build above it. By the dawn of the 17th century, the signs were clear. Spain was still mighty, still feared, still wealthy on paper. But the cracks in the foundation had begun to widen. Its economy was fragile, its debts were massive, its people were restless, and its rivals were rising. All the while, the mines of Mexico and Peru continued to echo with the clang of pickaxes and the cries of laborers, fueling an empire too vast, too proud, and too dependent on silver to change course. While the Spanish Empire celebrated silver as its divine blessing, for the people who extracted it, silver was a curse. Nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the dark tunnels of Potosí and Zacatecas, where dreams of empire were built on the backs of broken bodies. At the heart of the mining economy was the Mita system, a colonial adaptation of an old Incan labor draft. Under the Spanish version, indigenous communities were required to send a portion of their male population to labor in the mines for a set period each year. In practice, this became a form of forced servitude that devastated families, villages, and entire ethnic groups. Men, often teenagers and elders alike, were dragged from their homes and forced to work high in the Andes, where thin air and freezing temperatures made life brutal even before the labor began. Once underground, they spent 12 to 18 hours a day chipping at rock faces, hauling sacks of ore, and enduring deadly cave-ins. Some never saw sunlight again. They called Cerro Rico the mountain that eats men. And it did. Working conditions were nightmarish. Inside the narrow, oxygen-starved shafts, mercury fumes from refining processes poisoned lungs. Accidents were frequent. Collapse was common. The average life expectancy for a miner was tragically short, sometimes less than a year once inside the system. By the late 1500s, it's estimated that tens of thousands of indigenous people had perished in the mines. Entire populations were displaced. Birth rates plummeted. Epidemics spread easily among labor camps and mining towns. The cultural loss was incalculable, but the empire needed more. To fill the labor gap, especially as indigenous populations collapsed under the weight of disease and overwork, the Spanish crown authorized and expanded the African slave trade into the mining sector. Enslaved Africans, seen as more resilient to the harsh conditions, were purchased through networks in the Caribbean and Brazil and transported overland to mines in Mexico and Peru. These individuals faced their own brand of horror, torn from their homelands, subjected to violent transits, and forced into labor with no legal protection. They were considered expendable assets. Spanish administrators tallied their lives like cargo manifests. They died in the same shafts. They suffered the same mercury poisoning. They rebelled the same way, quietly, strategically, and sometimes explosively. And yet, amid all this suffering, resistance persisted. Not all resistance was violent. Some men sabotaged tools or slowed production. Others faked illness or fled into remote valleys. There were communities of escaped indigenous and African laborers, called cimarrones or palanques, that formed in hidden regions of the Andes or jungles of New Granada. These communities preserved ancestral customs, languages, and pride while refusing to submit. In certain moments, resistance boiled over into open revolt. One of the most famous examples occurred in the 1570s in Potosí, where a wave of indigenous miners coordinated a walkout, demanding better treatment and more food. Though suppressed, their defiance shook colonial administrators, who feared that without labor, the mountain would fall silent and the empire would collapse. There were also whispers, hard to confirm but persistent in Spanish letters, of spiritual resistance. Indigenous workers reportedly performed secret rituals in mine shafts to ask for protection from Pachamama, the Earth Mother of Andean belief. In some regions, offerings were made in hidden shrines, mixing Catholic and indigenous elements in quiet rebellion against the imperial order. Resistance took root in the culture as well. Songs, carvings, and even prayers carried stories of defiance. Oral traditions passed down tales of miners who escaped or cursed the Spanish gods. These were not mere legends. They were acts of survival, of memory, of dignity in a world designed to strip all three away. The Spanish crown, of course, saw none of this. Its attention remained fixed on the weight of silver bars and the promises of empire. But within the cracks of that imperial dream, the voices of the oppressed endured. They whispered through the shafts, hummed in the mountain winds, and waited. For freedom, for justice, for the mountain to give something back. Even today, Potosí stands. The mines are still active. Tourists walk through shafts once carved by enslaved hands. Local guides tell the stories of those who died, those who fought, and those who prayed to be remembered. And they are. By the end of the 16th century, silver from the New World wasn't just enriching Spain, it was reshaping the global economy. The mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico didn't just fuel the Spanish Empire, they ignited the first sparks of global capitalism. It began with volume. The sheer scale of silver extraction was unprecedented. Between 1545 and 1600, it's estimated that the Spanish colonies produced over 100 million kilograms of silver. Potosí alone became so productive that it was said to be a mountain of pure silver, visible on Spanish coins minted across Europe. That silver had to go somewhere, and it did, fast. From the ports of Veracruz, Acapulco, and Lima, silver traveled across the Atlantic and Pacific in massive state-run fleets. Some crossed the Atlantic to Seville, where the goods were distributed throughout Spain and into the financial hubs of Amsterdam, Genoa, and Antwerp. Others flowed westward across the Pacific through the Manila galleon trade, reaching China, India, and Southeast Asia. It was one of the earliest examples of a truly global trade network. Silver, binding three continents in economic codependency. In China, silver was especially coveted. The Ming Dynasty had recently shifted its tax system, requiring peasants and merchants to pay in silver rather than grain or goods. This created an enormous demand. Chinese merchants, in turn, traded silk, porcelain, and spices, goods highly desired in Europe, in exchange for this New World treasure. Spanish silver, mined by indigenous and African laborers thousands of miles away, was now the engine of commerce across Asia. This flow of silver transformed banking. It fueled the growth of merchant capitalism, empowering banking families like the Fuggers and Medicis to finance empires, wars, and entire trade expeditions. It encouraged the rise of stock companies like the Dutch East India Company. It redefined wealth from land-based nobility to liquid capital. But as fast as it came in, silver also broke economies. Spain, ironically, was one of the first victims. With so much silver flooding its economy, inflation soared. Prices doubled, then tripled. The price revolution devastated Spain's working classes, whose wages couldn't keep up. Agricultural decline and military overspending left the empire reliant on foreign creditors. The empire was rich in silver, but poor in sustainability. Other powers took note. The Dutch, English, and French began building their own colonial dreams, not to convert souls or spread faith, but to tap into this silver-fueled global network. The wealth pouring out of Mexico and Peru was a lesson. Resources meant power, and control over trade routes meant dominance. Silver also reordered social hierarchies in the Americas. A class of Spanish-born elites, the Peninsulares, gained wealth and influence as mine owners, administrators, and merchants. Below them, the Criollos, American-born Spaniards, jostled for power. Indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and mixed-race populations were systemically excluded, cementing a rigid caste system. Religion, too, adapted to silver. Churches were built with silver donations. Cathedrals glistened with mined treasure. Orders like the Jesuits used silver-backed wealth to fund schools and missions. Faith and finance, once rivals, now walked hand in hand. Even culture shifted. European art, clothing, and architecture in the Americas evolved with the wealth of silver. Lavish mansions lined Lima's streets. Nobles flaunted Chinese silks bought with Peruvian silver. Spanish America was no longer a rugged outpost. It was a global participant. But beneath this prosperity lay a system built on suffering. Every coin minted in Seville, every shipment offloaded in Manila, every gem-studded altar in Mexico City carried the shadow of the laborers who mined the silver. Their names were rarely recorded. Their pain is seldom honored. Yet their hands shaped the world. Today, economists and historians recognize the silver trade as a turning point in human history. It shifted the balance of power from east to west. It laid the groundwork for modern banking, international trade, and even consumerism. It connected villages in the Andes to markets in Beijing, parishes in Madrid, and docks in Manila. The silver rush of the 1500s didn't just build an empire. It created a global system we still live in today. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Empire's silver lifeline stretched across oceans, deserts, and jungle trails, from the mines of Potosí and Zacatecas to the vaults of Seville. But where there was silver, there was danger. And not just from the earth itself. Pirates, privateers, smugglers, and opportunists smelled blood and gold, like sharks circling a bleeding ship. The treasure fleets became targets, legendary convoys of wealth traveling the Atlantic with a fortune aboard. Spain's annual flotas carried precious metals, spices, and trade goods, sailing in heavily armed galleons under the protection of warships. But they were not invincible. The Caribbean, with its maze of islands and hidden coves, became a theater of maritime ambush. English, French, and Dutch privateers, some state-sponsored, others barely distinguishable from outright pirates, began to raid Spain's treasure ships and settlements with increasing boldness. Men like Francis Drake, dubbed El Drake by the Spaniards, became infamous for swooping down on coastal cities, stealing silver, and vanishing into the sea. In 1579, Drake captured the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, a Spanish galleon loaded with Peruvian silver off the coast of Ecuador. The loot was staggering: over 80 pounds of gold and 26 tons of silver. It was one of the richest hauls in pirate history. To the English crown, Drake was a hero. To Spain, he was a sea demon. But not all thieves came with cutlasses and cannons. Smugglers, some of them Spanish colonists themselves, circumvented the crown's strict trade monopolies, selling silver and goods to rival nations. The Spanish crown insisted that all colonial trade pass through its official ports and routes. Yet enforcement was difficult across such vast territories. Markets in the Caribbean and even in the interior often saw illegal trade flourishing in the shadows. Meanwhile, Portugal's Iberian union with Spain, 1580 to 1640, complicated matters further. Dutch and English ships, now barred from Portuguese ports, turned hostile. The Dutch, enraged by Spanish persecution during the 80 Years' War, launched their own West India Company and targeted Spanish ships with precision and brutality. The seas became battlegrounds. Spanish colonial cities fortified their ports. Galleons added more cannons. Coastal watchtowers scanned the horizon for black sails. Yet the attacks kept coming. Silver had become not just wealth, it had become a weapon, a motive for war, and a symbol of power. Even nature played its part. Hurricanes scattered fleets. Shipworms devoured hulls. Entire convoys disappeared beneath the waves, dragging tons of treasure to the ocean floor. For every galleon that reached Seville, another risked being lost to pirates, storms, or sabotage. Back in Europe, the struggle for silver reshaped diplomacy and war. The constant drain of resources to defend convoys and fight enemies abroad strained Spain's finances. Ironically, the very silver that had made Spain rich also helped bankrupt it. Inflation soared. The cost of war outpaced the treasure it could safely bring home. In the Americas, fear spread with every ship that failed to arrive. Mines continued production, but stockpiles grew as transport routes became more dangerous. Local governors begged Madrid for more protection. Some even took matters into their own hands, hiring mercenaries or forging deals with shady captains to sneak silver out under the radar. Yet despite all this chaos, silver kept moving. It funded armies. It fed empires. It filled the treasuries of merchant republics and monarchies alike. The struggle for silver was a global drama, part crime story, part economic revolution. By the turn of the 17th century, Spain had fortified its convoy system and cracked down on smuggling. But the golden age of piracy was beginning. The oceans, like the mines, were now battlefields. And every bar of silver carried not just value, but blood. The brilliance of silver lit up the courts of Madrid and Lisbon. It bankrolled palaces, wars, and conquests. But beneath that glow, hidden in the shadows of mountains and mines, lay a human cost so vast it haunted the very foundation of the colonial empires. Silver didn't just fund Europe's future. It buried thousands of lives to get there. From the 1540s onward, indigenous labor was ruthlessly mobilized in the Andes, especially around the Cerro Rico de Potosí, the richest silver deposit in the world. Spain institutionalized the Mita system, a brutal rotational draft inherited from the Inca. Under Spanish rule, however, it transformed from a civic duty into a death sentence. Communities were obligated to send quotas of men to the mines, where they worked in suffocating tunnels, often hundreds of meters below the surface, with little air, light, or food. Miners were subjected to mercury exposure in the refining process, the patio method, a chemical innovation that allowed low-grade ores to be processed efficiently but poisoned countless workers in the process. Symptoms of mercury poisoning, tremors, neurological breakdowns, hallucinations, were rampant. Some died within months. Others, unable to return to their communities, became ghost-like figures wandering the mining settlements. The death toll in Potosí is still debated, but conservative estimates suggest that by the 1600s, hundreds of thousands had perished in the region. One Jesuit observer wrote, "Every piece of silver has cost the life of an Indian." That wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was a grim calculation. In Mexico, the scenario was similarly devastating. The mines of Zacatecas, Guanajuato, and Taxco saw a mix of wage labor, coercion, and indigenous tribute systems. Some indigenous communities fled to avoid conscription. Others negotiated to pay tribute in silver rather than labor. But in all cases, the burden was immense. Food shortages, forced relocation, and epidemic disease often followed the trail of silver. When the indigenous population could no longer meet the labor demands, enslaved Africans were brought into mining operations. Though more commonly used in agriculture or domestic settings, enslaved Africans were also forced into mines, especially in New Spain. Their mortality rates were staggering. The combination of overwork, unfamiliar climates, poor diets, and rampant disease reduced lifespans drastically. They were treated as expendable, tools for extraction rather than human beings. The mines also became a vortex for social collapse. Entire indigenous villages were emptied of their men. Families were broken apart. Cultural traditions were disrupted. The trauma of silver extraction wasn't only physical, it was generational. Stories passed down through oral history recount the dread of the Mita lottery, of sons who never returned, of mothers who starved waiting. The colonial administration, primarily focused on profit, justified the losses as the cost of civilization. Some religious voices pushed back. Bartolomé de las Casas had earlier condemned the abuses of the Encomienda. Still, even in his time, the extraction of silver had moved beyond land grants into a new phase of systemic exploitation. A few officials attempted reforms, but their efforts were often undercut by the crown's insatiable hunger for revenue. Ironically, much of the silver didn't stay in Spain. It flowed to China via the Manila Galleons, paying for silk, porcelain, and tea. Spain became a channel rather than a container, rich in metal but riddled with debt. Even as native bodies were crushed under the weight of empire, the empire itself was becoming dependent on the very silver that consumed it. By the late 1500s, the toll in human lives was impossible to ignore. The wealth dazzled the world, but behind every coin, every goblet, every jeweled crucifix was the silent scream of a life extinguished. Silver had reshaped the world economy, but it did so by reshaping the bones of millions into the scaffold of a global system. The cost of silver was not only counted in coins, it was measured in breathless lungs, broken backs, lost languages, and grieving mothers. It paid for empire, yes, but the interest, it seemed, would be eternal. Long after the mines quieted and the colonial flags faded, the silver still spoke. It spoke through the wealth that transformed Spain into a superpower. Briefly, through the towering cathedrals in Seville, the fleets of the Armada, the gilt-lined altars of colonial churches, but it also echoed in places far removed from the Andes and New Spain, in Chinese markets, Ottoman treasuries, Dutch counting houses. Silver was not just a mineral. It became the bloodstream of early global capitalism. By the late 1500s and into the 1600s, nearly half of the world's silver was flowing from the Americas. The mines at Potosí and Zacatecas had turned the New World into a colossal engine of extraction. And yet, the very empires built upon silver were quietly eroding from within. Spain, flush with bullion, became addicted to imports. It neglected domestic industry and agriculture, instead buying what it needed from Northern Europe. Inflation surged, what historians call the price revolution, making life harder for ordinary Spaniards. Silver had enriched the crown, but destabilized its economy. By the early 17th century, Spain was drowning in debt, even as its treasure fleets continued to sail. The mines, once symbols of inexhaustible wealth, began to show signs of exhaustion. Rich surface veins had been stripped. As shafts plunged deeper, the costs rose. Pumps, timber, labor, everything became more complex. Deaths increased. Profits narrowed. Still, the demands from Europe never stopped. But the shadow of silver extended beyond the economy. In the Americas, the legacy of the silver economy had reshaped the land and its people. Indigenous societies were permanently altered. Some communities, like those near Potosí, were hollowed out. Their languages weakened, their rituals disrupted. Others, especially in Mexico, adapted and found ways to negotiate the system, often through tribute and semi-autonomy. But all bore the scars. The forced labor systems, Mita, Encomienda, repartimiento, laid the groundwork for racial hierarchies that would endure centuries. Colonial officials and settlers institutionalized a social caste system based on blood, birthplace, and proximity to European identity. At the very bottom stood the people who had extracted the empire's wealth with their own hands. The environmental damage was also staggering. Mountains were hollowed. Forests were clear-cut for mine timbers. Mercury, essential to refining silver, poisoned rivers and soils. Some of these ecological wounds still linger today in the Andean highlands. Culturally, the silver rush had fused two worlds in a violent, often tragic synthesis. Indigenous knowledge of metallurgy, agriculture, and engineering had been harnessed and exploited. Colonial churches rose beside ruined temples. Catholic saints absorbed the identities of native deities. A hybrid world emerged, rich in color, but born in blood. Globally, silver from the Americas fueled the rise of Asia-Europe trade. Much of it reached Ming China, which had transitioned to a silver-based tax system. Without Mexican and Peruvian silver, China's economy may have stalled. The Manila Galleons, sailing between Acapulco and the Philippines, formed one of the first truly global trade routes, connecting American mines to Asian markets via the Pacific. And yet, none of this was sustainable. By the end of the 16th century, Europe faced economic contractions. Spain declared multiple bankruptcies. Revolts flared in its colonies. And though silver still flowed, the world it had helped build was cracking under its weight. Today, the echo of silver is faint but persistent. It rings in the coin collections of museums, in the Spanish surnames that dot Latin America, in the architecture of cities like Potosí, once grand, now faded. It lives in the oral histories of indigenous peoples whose ancestors were taken by the mines. And it endures in the debates about wealth, exploitation, and global inequality. Silver made the modern world, but it did not make it fair. It offered the illusion of limitless riches while concealing the real cost behind imperial grandeur. In the end, the story of silver is the story of ambition without foresight, of extraction without empathy. It is a monument to what happens when profit is prized above people, and a warning that every glittering empire casts a long, dark shadow.